Good afternoon, Sim Gamers. This is Bree Ducamp, and I'm here to share some initial results from my study, Spatial Skills in Makerspaces. There are three bodies of work that informed the design of this study in terms of its content. The first is my experience as a classroom teacher, which led me to research the misconceptions that many students have regarding mathematics content area. In particular, looking at surface area and volume relationships. Students tend to really struggle with these two concepts, and I would like to find a way to help them improve their understanding of them for daily life. The second area of research that has informed this project is the development of spatial skills. Spatial skills are the ability to visualize and manipulate objects mentally, but spatial skills are also very important in the development of other disciplinary knowledge, in particular in areas like chemistry, engineering, and mathematics. But I think spatial skills can also relate to all kinds of daily activities in life. Historically, they haven't really been taught in schools because we were very dependent on lectures and paper and pencil, but now that we have technology as a way to produce more visual ways of learning, I'm interested in seeing how those aspects can be developed. The third area that I'd like to talk a little bit about are makerspaces. As many of you know, I've been involved in an initiative with the county schools looking at creating places where students can build and design creations of their own. While the students seem to be quick to adapt to this form of learning, a lot of the teachers really struggle both with justifying the amount of time that it takes to create some of these products, as well as finding ways to match them to the standards that teachers need to teach. So in an effort to address the surface area and volume for students, the development of spatial skills in a broader sense, and to support teachers in their use of and comfort in makerspaces, a unit was developed in which students use computer-aided design software and digital fabrication in which they create and build some shapes to help them understand these mathematical concepts. So this project, the rationale for it is based on Olympio and Zachariah's framework for blended environments, in which both physical and virtual manipulatives have important qualities, but when designing a particular unit, the benefits of those particular strategies need to be focused on when you're choosing which activities to conduct virtually or physically. The theoretical framework that I'm basing this on is a social constructivist view, but in particular I'm looking at Wurst's flavor of social constructivism. And so a couple of main points just to think about where I'm coming from in this is that in terms of the social piece, I'm looking at the dynamics both of the students with each other as they deepen their understanding and participate in these activities, but also looking at how the teachers interact with students and play a slightly different role in these makerspace environments. In terms of the constructivism, obviously, one of the main things that this activity provides is the opportunity for students to physically and virtually build objects to help them understand mathematics in a new way, using the computer-aided design and fabrication elements involved in the activities, which I'll describe in a bit more depth soon. The two research questions that guided this study are: do spatial skills and mathematical content knowledge change in a makerspace unit on surface area and volume? And how does prior knowledge impact student learning and activity in makerspaces? In general, the methodology involved the work of 23 fifth graders and 2 teachers. It was a gifted resource teacher and the homeroom teacher, as they participated in 4 mathematics lessons that comprised this unit. And Pre and post tests included both mathematical content questions as well as spatial skills questions to measure how students were learning and changing. So the first day or lesson, students basically built shapes of varying types to reinforce their understanding of basic properties of three-dimensional shapes like faces, edges, and vertices. They also manipulated some of these facts to understand Euler's formula and the relationship between these properties, as well as to give students a chance to refresh and introduce some new vocabulary that relates to three-dimensional shapes. The second lesson involves students actually designing rectangular prisms that are then used for later activities. But in this time, students tended to benefit both from the opportunity to really explore the CAD environment and to see how objects, as they were manipulated virtually, matched up to their nets or unfolded versions. The other thing that seemed to really play a big part in this was the idea of student ownership, and that seemed to be very motivating for a number of the students. So after students had designed and assembled rectangular prisms, the next section of learning focused on surface area. So students basically looked at their rectangular prisms and tried to determine their surface area, and then also to determine the surface area of other regular shapes such as cubes and rectangular prisms with different dimensions like 3 by 5 by 1 inch rectangular prisms, etc. A challenge problem involved students actually trying to find the surface area of pyramids, which was interesting. And then the last part is that students applied these strategies that they had come up with to determine the surface area of objects by building irregular shapes with blocks and challenging their table mates and teammates to identify the surface area of those. The fourth lesson involved students' understanding of volume, and this one starts off a bit differently from the others. In this case, students are asked to estimate the number of pieces of candy in 2 separate containers. What's interesting is that while these containers actually have the same volume, because they are differently shaped, they have different surface areas. So that's one strategy that we use to help students dissociate their belief that surface area and volume are always the same. So after this estimation exercise, students share some of their strategies for determining volume and begin to find some formulas or ways of figuring out the volume or how much stuff something has inside of it. And then they apply some of those same strategies to their rectangular prisms and block shapes. So the first thing that I did was I wanted to find out whether there was a significant difference in students' pre and post tests. So I broke down the tests into some different areas. Looking at questions relating to area, there was a significant difference, and on the overall content, there was a significant difference from the beginning to the end of the unit, which means that overall, in terms of learning about surface area and volume, this unit seemed to be effective. There did not seem to be a change in mental rotation ability, which wasn't totally surprising because students didn't actually do a lot of mental rotations. However, that assessment was included because it's a pretty standard baseline for overall spatial skills ability in students, and you'll see in just a moment why we used it. I was pleased to see that students did significantly improve in folding abilities, and a paper folding test. Students did significantly better because those activities tend to match closer to the surface area concept that was involved in this unit, as well as the digital fabrication activities. And overall, there was a significant increase in spatial skills. Due to the small Number of participants, the effect sizes for all of these activities were fairly small, but my hope is that once we run the unit in the future, we'll be able to get a better idea of how much of an effect, a more realistic idea of how much this unit affects student abilities. Another level of analysis that I took was that there are a number of studies indicating that students with high and low spatial abilities, as well as students with high and low prior content knowledge, may learn in different ways from each other. So what we found is that students that had high content prior knowledge tended to make gains. They tended to do about one question better on the content scores and one question better on the spatial scores, which is a good thing. However, it's not a major change. Similarly, when we look at students who had a lower content prior knowledge, their spatial skills didn't improve much at all, but their content knowledge did improve a bit. When we look, however, there's some evidence that students with high spatial abilities process things differently from low spatial ability. So when we look at those kinds of things, we actually find that the students with high spatial ability made about 2 questions growth in content. So it seems that students with higher spatial ability tend to make some significant growth, which is good. Not necessarily significant, but at least make some positive gains. But their spatial scores actually dropped a bit. I think this is in part because a few of the students didn't have time to finish their post-tests, and so they left some questions blank. But I can't be sure of that. But what's really striking is the students with low spatial abilities tended to make the greatest gains. They tended to get 5 content questions more correct than at the pretest, and they tended to get 3 spatial questions more than in the pretest. Considering that there were 15 content questions, that's a drastic improvement in terms of math content understanding, as well as spatial skills development. So it seems that this unit may have really helped develop some students' abilities. So there are some limitations to this study. It's a fairly brief intervention, and in fact with this particular pilot group, we ran all of the lessons back to back in one school day, which means that the effects may be different if it is implemented over the course of a week in a typical classroom. The small sample size may obviously affect results. And then another thing that's worth keeping track of is the fact that while the paper folding assessment pretty similarly matched the contents of surface area, there wasn't really a spatial test that was as well matched to volume understanding that was used. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, some students didn't have time to finish their post-tests, so we want to make sure to provide that in future runs. Some of the implications of this study are that students with low spatial skills in particular showed the most growth, which seems to be a positive thing because the hope is that as spatial skills are raised, they can help performance in other areas. Some future work involves revising the assessment to reflect a more balanced coverage of shape properties, surface area, and volume. There were not equal number of questions focusing on each content area. And I'd also like to locate a relevant spatial test that relates to the volume work that students did during this study. So overall, thank you for listening, and I hope you are having a great afternoon.